Hello and welcome to the fifth episode of the TSSI series. Today we have three of us on the call, and hopefully soon we'll have one more. Lexi, would you like to introduce yourself? Say hi.
Hey there, I'm Lexi. You might know me from Swampside Chats podcast, and this book is something I've read maybe a little too much a few years ago, and it's good to get reacquainted with it.
Very good. Now, also, we have Rosa from Swampside Chats. Rosa, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just reading through this book and with the rest of y'all sort of on and off. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. Huh?
Rosa, I'm very disappointed. I was expecting some, really breakthrough comments there. You've let the side down.
I know.
Well, yeah, I'm getting outnumbered here by Swampside Chats, so I kind of want Derek to come on soon. I never thought I'd hear myself saying that,
Oh, come
but
on.
let's start without him. He said he'd be on in a few minutes.
I mean, Derek props up all kinds of podcasts on his own, so it's good to have him on.
He truly does. The man is an hyperactive podcaster. If ever there was one, we'd all be lost without him.
Yep.
Now, so we're finished chapter 1, 2, and 3. I just wanted to say one or two small things about last week's one before we start, basically 2 hours. One of them, I said that Sheikh was an TSSI guy, but I don't think that is true. He was somebody who tried to fix the dual system interpretations. As far as I can see in the book, I got a bit mistaken exactly what system he tried to fix, but it wasn't TSSI. I checked that again. So he was trying to reconcile the dual simultaneous system. So that's just a quick correction there. Also, Emmanuel, when we're talking about the 5p equals 4p plus r times 4p equation that blew all our minds, he was correct when he talked about the markup in the equation, about how it's an assumption and that it shouldn't necessarily be non-positive. And I said that he was wrong. And I said he was wrong, and then when Pouya said it again, I said Pouya was right. So it shows you how much clarity I had last week. I was extremely tired, but I've just had a power nap, literally 1 hour's power nap before we started. So hopefully I won't be making so many basic errors this week. Right. Will we start with chapter 4? Who wants to take this introductory period, introduction chapter 4.1? Lexi, let's go to you first, seeing that you didn't get first last week. Do you want to have a stab?
Yeah, let's do it. So he starts out by saying it's pretty weird to do this in a book on Marxist political economy. However, Marxists are terrible at doing interpretation. They violate the standard norms of interpretation. And he says they're acceptable within economics more generally. He blames the whole myth of internal inconsistency on this. And he feels like if Marxists and Straussians adopted the hermeneutic principles, the interpretive principles that he's going to lay out, that this all would have been settled in Marx's favor a long time ago. He's setting up, let's try to get this person's name right. Scripanti.
Yeah, he goes into this kind of slightly obscure kind of screed against this guy Scripanti. Does anybody think it's worth actually reading through this? Because it doesn't seem like he's just quoting like weird sections and things he said. Like in section 2 here, he says, equations 1, 3, 4, and 6 weren't originals and all of that it's very hard to actually make sense of it when you're not going to read the paper. Is it worth going into it?
I just want to make a couple comments before we even do that. The first thing is that this chapter is called Making Marx Make Sense, which is a flip on an analytical Marxist book, Making Sense of Marx. Second would be that he stresses that the point of the book is about Marx's argument and Marx's internal inconsistency, and not whether Marx's argument is true. That's one of the biggest strengths of this book, and I think he succeeds in making this case, in part because of this chapter that you would almost never see. I think Richard Wolff talks about interpretive method and is kind of, I think, like a post-Althusserian or something nuts like that. But I so rarely see this discussed, and I think this chapter basically seals that it's really hard to make a case against Marx's argument being this, because of the interpretive principles he's laying out.
Okay, Rosa, do you have anything to say on this initial chapter? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, he basically, like, he fundamentally, like, draws it back to, like, sort of an interpretive problem, like, all these sort of, like, false interpretations are, like, based on, like, Marx is not really understanding, like, the specific hermeneutics. Oh, man, butchering that word. Hermeneutics that he's trying to use. A little bit later, he talks about, like, a scientific version of hermeneutics a little bit later on, but, like, yeah, basically they're not. It's a fundamental problem of not really reading Marx right that has led to this sort of, like, problem of, like, claims of internal inconsistency within Marx's theory of labor value and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
It seems to me like it's a kind of a cottage industry. I remember listening to Doug Lane's podcast, and he had some guy on who I can't remember his name now, talking about how, value theory really doesn't apply now that we've got, like, the internet or something. And you're kind of going, oh my God, this is the level of kind of interpretations and understandings of it go from, good kind of mathematical kind of slight misinterpretations to the full gamut of just plain like a lack of understanding. So I find this chapter fine, but I personally, I find this chapter, I imagine that you guys will probably be more interested, or Derek will be more interested in this chapter than me. That
Definitely.
It's something that I just kind of find, I have any arguments really with any of the logic. I would parse it. So he gives an example here. Are we okay to go into 4.2 about how not to interpret? Basically, this is a kind of a screed against this guy Scripanti, who came up with a proof that Marx's value theoretic account of exploitation is logically inconsistent. And the basic point that Andrew is making here is that Scripanti uses his own definitions of Marx's definitions and comes up with conclusions on that. And that, you have to define what somebody actually says initially correctly and deduce from that. And if you deduce it from that, that's fair enough. But you don't just choose your own definitions. You have to kind of show that your definitions are actually what Marx would have said. So I don't know if there's too much. I think he's basically much just giving an example of the type of thing that gets done, whereby people have their own ideas of what Marx said he said and then deduce away from that. But Andrew's trying to make the point that you have to be extremely careful with your initial starting point, because everything else falls if you don't get those initial ones correct. Much like people are, well, yeah, that's about it. Does anybody have anything else to say on what he talks about Scripanti here?
What's significant about this is that apparently Scripanti is it in a footnote? Let's see. Apparently the Scripanti paper references the TSSI in the appendix.
Okay,
but
yeah, let me see it. Yeah.
But then claims that, Marx is inconsistent based on Scripanti's formalization, without acknowledging the TSSI or the SSSI, which apparently would have also solved the incoherence problem, the logical inconsistency. And I think this might even be where the focus on logical inconsistency comes from, because that's a quote that's quoted from the Schroffian Marxist Discrepancy. So
Yeah, he also makes a point about like journals. I think that's the thing that kind of Andrew has also had some kind of throwdowns with different journals on what they print and what they comments they make, and they allow people to make about the TSSI and things like this. Let me just read this passage here. Despite all of this, at least one editor of a respected heterodox journal of economics, and presumably some referees as well, deems Scropanti's inverted commas proof worthy of publication. This case is far from unique. As we shall see throughout this book, those who have proved, inverted commas, that Marx was internally inconsistent, and those who published their work seem rarely, if ever, to have considered the possibility that Marx's arguments may admit of a different interpretation. And when their interpretations are unable to make Marx's text make sense, this is invariably taken to be proof of his inconsistency rather than evidence of their own misinterpretation. So, like, I think, yeah, that kind of idea is we see is kind of repeated throughout the chapter, I think. Anybody have any problems with what he is saying so far?
No problems. Just this is a good example of a very neutrally written paragraph that clearly has a deep amount of resentment, probably righteous, at the standards of academic economics. And if anyone spent a little time in an economics department, but I mean, I'm assuming especially an economics department that has some of the culture of leftist academia. Yeah, it sounds pretty rough.
I don't even know how many heterodox economic journals there out there, so it must be like such a small and like insular sort of thing to the point where it's like cliquish.
Yeah.
And
Well,
catty,
I think most like reasonably sized colleges will have one heterodox economist on the books. Like, as in, they may not be teaching heterodox stuff, but I'd be surprised. There are heterodox economists. In Ireland or something. There's not that many universities. They do exist, but so I think there's probably a few journals. But
well, the most important heterodox journal is actually the Cambridge Journal of Economics, which is apparently perfectly fine with publishing a bunch of heterodox cranks, including Kleiman. One of Kleiman's articles about Whiggish history and economics got published in the Cambridge Journal of Economics.
Yeah, well, I think they have a history in Cambridge. They have a history of having Marxist and Schraffians and all these dudes. So they have an institutional history of it, a culture of it. Okay, well, we shift on to section 4.3. Where's Derek? Derek should be in here arguing with us all and stretching this out. We'll be finished half an hour at this rate. Right. Who wants to take this one? Rosa, do you want to have a go at this? The meaning and interpretation of analytical arguments.
Sure. I mean, maybe I need to look over it again. I'm just like, yeah. Let me just look over it, Lexi. Yeah. I'm cool. Bad.
No, you're not bad. I think
I looked over this at like 8 a.m. when I was like half asleep. So
I think there's a reason that this is maybe a little confounding. Sometimes it feels like these things maybe shouldn't need to be said. Like for instance, he's going into the difference between a meaning and an interpretation, and some of the scholarship that he's reflecting on is talking about like maybe, it could be like your own personal meaning, or it could be this kind of meaning. And I just want everyone to notice that for most of these citations, we're dealing with, okay, we got one in the 60s. Okay, Rorty, 1991. And we got Hogan, 1996. We got, 2001. That's pretty close. And we got another Hogan, 96. There we go. There is a specific thing going on in the 90s where
Do you want to read that? Do you want to read that line there? I've got highlighted there for you.
Oh, yeah. Let's take a look at that. Yeah. Hogan lists 9 different possible meanings of a text's, quote, meaning. Everything from the, quote, conscious, truth conditional meaning of the author, quote, to the publisher's political aim, quote. And he suggests many more. And so when I was maybe being a bit uncharitable to value form theory and was saying dismissive things about Derrida, like, Kleiman is signaling here that it is not required that you take this kind of bitter, fashionable nonsense, analytical point of view towards this kind of acknowledging that people have different reasons for reading a text. I think this is a strength of his book, that he refrains from weighing on this, because I don't know what he would say, but the thing that I think is materially important is that because he's had such a mindfuck of a time in leftist academia, trying to basically say that, well, this is what Marx said, why can't you read this? He's developed an appreciation for, radical epistemology, and that's where a lot of the feels for post-structuralism came from, was, well, you clowns are doing this wrong anyway. Not that, and I think you could feel this way even if you don't adopt the interpretive norms of post-structuralism. You can kind of understand why lefties would be inclined to accept some of the more like radical arguments that end up in the humanities regarding interpretation. People get nihilistic about what things mean. But for Kleiman, it's not really important to condemn people for not accepting the truth in all interpretive cases. The point is, why are you interpreting the text?
Yeah, like he is quite, I always find he's quite open on this. He doesn't seem to care why, he thinks there's a validity to interpreting different ways. So that, I think, like, he's not being, a control freak and saying, no, you can only read it this way. You can't read it as a literary text or anything like this, But when you actually try and say what Marx meant, you have to try and do a proper, I think, exegetical hermeneutic reading.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was more generally the, quote, no bullshit school, quote, that was apparently reading Marx in this kind of bullshitty way. Whereas I guess people that are into this radical epistemology, again, like Richard Wolff and Stephen Resnick, have a whole, in my opinion, kind of weird like epistemology and like philosophy of science section to their work that's sort of post-Althusserian, sort of post-structuralist, like really coming from a strange place. They assign Stephen Resnick has a Marxian economics course in which you read some Richard Rorty. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of weird. And it's one of those interesting things, again, that you have inverted, where the no bullshit people are pushing a very strained claim of interpretation on Marx, and the people that are more permissive about interpreting things seem to have a more consistent reading. What the fuck?
So when you say post-Althusserian, what do you mean for?
All right, let's
people
break
like
this
me?
down. Probably, regrettably, one of the most influential theories, one of the most influential theorists and philosophers of the 20th century is a man named Louis Althusser. He was a French Communist Party dude. And he made his career by making like big sweeping assumptions about Marx or society and then breaking from them And towards the end of his life, he kind of, his conception of Marxist science, which was so important to him, sort of versus all the ideology, collapses, and he sort of ends up in a scary place where he realizes he can't really tell the ideology from the science anymore. And that is a very influential thought world for critical theory and for Marxists more generally. So the post-structuralists are starting with the assumptions that Althusser has at the end of his career. Althusser being ahead of something called structural Marxism, which is why it's called post-structuralism after this guy. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So they're trying to say that, say Marx's ideas of, say, exploitation or whatever that are in the theory, they can only be looked at ideologically and not scientifically.
Basically, for a guy like Althusser, I sometimes call it an Illuminati theory of ideology. It's everywhere. There's a quote he says that pointing out ideology is like pointing out water to a fish. And of course, there's some pull to these things, but I think if you interpret them extremely literally, as people are wont to do when you write sentences, you're setting yourself up maybe for a paranoid breaker of some kind.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just eating a bit of popcorn. I'm trying to mute my mic when I'm talking.
Me versus the Paris Strangler is always entertaining.
Yes. Okay. So let's keep going. Is there anything? Let's have a look here. So he's trying to talk about how you can say which is the best interpretation of Marx's value theory. So let me just read this paragraph. Two people who disagree vociferously about which is the best interpretation of Marx's value theory might agree on the answer to such questions as which interpretation of Marx's texts best exploits his value theory in furtherance of the physicalist research program, and which interpretation best establishes what Marx would, under ideal conditions, reply to questions about the terms of his analytical arguments, which are phrased in terms which he could understand right off the bat. So he's just showing, two different people's, ideas of what's the best way to interpret Marx. It's quite dependent on what somebody is trying to get at. Okay. Yeah. But it says, but he's saying this book deals exclusively with the last question. Okay. Not to say that there aren't other ways to do it, but this is what it's about. The reason why it does so is simple. The claim that Marx's arguments are internally consistent is a claim that is impossible to deduce. Is a claim that it is impossible to deduce his conclusions from his premises when the premises and conclusions are construed as he intended them to be construed. It is therefore simply untenable to declare that Marx is internally inconsistent while simultaneously declaring that what he really meant is not the issue. Okay. Sorry, I've got some notifications coming in here. Yeah, does anybody have any problems with that? I feel like we're going to be saying the same thing again and again and again.
Yeah, that's why I'm trying to extrapolate a little bit from this, because why the fuck does this need to be here? Why do we need to have a chapter that says, hey, you should read the author and assume that if there's one way of reading it that makes sense, or maybe even a few that makes that, are coherent, you're going to prioritize those over others when testing the logical coherence of the thinker. Like that shouldn't have to be said. It's okay that people want to do a value form reading if they want, but that can't. Sometimes some of the things about value form that bother me is that they do this correction and replacement thing, so that when they're talking about Marx, they're talking about their reading of Marx. And I guess academics just sort of do this. It's good for them. It is a career class interest, you might say, on a sort of finer level than a regular class interest. Yeah.
Okay, let's
Yeah.
head on to. Sorry, go ahead there, Rosa.
Yeah, essentially, like, you could basically, like, summarize this chapter in, like just under 30 minutes. Well, like, for a podcast, you could probably just do this entire chapter under 30 minutes. Like, really could. It's just, like, what he's trying to say is that you shouldn't try to read into the text. Like, it's okay to do that in certain cases, but, like, when we're specifically talking about an argument relating to what Marx said, and if Marx has internal inconsistencies within the theory, it's obvious that, like, it's just obvious that we should be doing it based on what is in the text specifically, not what we want to read into the text. And, like, he goes into it a bit further with, like, this sort of, like, scientific hermeneutics that he puts forward. That I'm forgetting the name of the theorist that puts forward the scientific hermeneutics.
Yeah,
Hermeneutic
that's later on in the chapter. That's Stigler.
later on. Stigler. Yeah.
Schleiermacher, I think, is it? Oh, maybe not. Let's have a look at this chapter 4.4. I think this is quite interesting. I find this interesting. Knowing what an author meant. Let's just read this paragraph here. Okay, so it has been sometimes argued that we cannot know what an author meant, especially when, as in Marx's case, we cannot ask him or her. This argument presupposes that the author can know what he or she meant in a way that we cannot, directly through introspection. Empirical evidence suggests, however, that this is not so. Hogan notes that many psychological studies have indicated that our introspective judgment is highly fallible. Even on ordinary matters, my analyses of myself are as much matters of uncertain theoretical inference as are my analyses of other people, rather than reports of knowledge obtained directly through introspection. The difference between the problems we face in knowing what someone else meant and what we ourselves meant is therefore at most a difference of degree, not a difference of kind. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if I'd agree with that, but it's an interesting take. He then goes on to talk about, I don't know, what do people think about that? I don't know. I don't know enough about that. It just seems like it would be a difference of, it would seem to be like a kind of a difference of kind, but maybe it's not.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think the conclusion follows from the premises there.
Yeah.
I agree with all that stuff about, like, yeah, actually, when you're reading an argument, it is sort of like gathering evidence. That's interesting. You know what I mean? That's it's you can look at it almost like any other scientific enterprise. The conclusion.
He doesn't say that exactly yet, does he? This is just he's trying to say that he's saying here that basically the idea that introspection is more valid than just looking at trying to understand somebody through a text. He's saying that they're of a similar class of problem. That introspection in and of itself is fairly flawed, and that it's not entirely different.
I guess
trying to interpret their words.
It feels like a massive non sequitur because we're not talking about, like, sort of the introspection of, like, talking about, like, someone's personality traits. We're talking about what a text means, like what the person meant.
Yeah. I think this is a little shaky.
Yeah, it's a complete non sequitur. It just doesn't make sense because there's, like, he's trying to make the loose connection between the two because, like, introspection, what the person means, it's all in their head specifically, and only they can really know what they meant. And it's just like, oh, okay, that's a pretty loose connection when we're talking about, like, what is written. And
or somebody's ideas of their scientific theory. No, I know it's a little shaky, but I know. What am I going to say? Go on. You're going to say.
It just makes me think of Andrew's coming from a Hegelian Marxist background, and this seems like on the one hand, like Hegel sometimes accepts that self-knowledge can be so, obfuscating that sometimes the truth is more accessible to someone looking on from the outside than from the inside. On the other hand, do we really agree that that means that the different knowledge people have is just a difference in degree, not a different in kind? I guess I could see what he's saying, that there's no experiential knowledge, I guess, that it's a sort of, that the knowledge is a matter of like a universal, like theoretical inference, like, or it's a pretty standard analytic view now that I'm breaking it down.
Yeah, look, I think that, I think that the logic he says here is a therefore at most a difference of degree. I don't know if you can say that. I don't know if the argument is that solid that you can deduce from it, but you could put forward that as a theory that they're not that different. But anyway, it's
I think it's vague what he means, and there's a strong claim and a weak claim. And the weak claim is just that, like, some of the analytical philosophers are right, and you can isolate like thoughts, and that's sort of where knowledge is. It's not in like experience.
okay.
I mean,
Rosa.
one last, like, okay, so he doesn't really even have to make the argument, because like what Marx is saying, we know what Marx said because it's written on a page. It's written right in front of us. It's not like of course he can't really elaborate on it, but like it's already written, so we know what Marx meant. He meant what he wrote. I know that sounds kind of weird and simplistic, but like it's like in the text, and he elaborates further that we should be doing it based on what's in the text rather than like what how we want to spin it, essentially. Which,
yeah,
spinning it can be interesting, but like when we're specifically talking about the issue that he wants to talk about, it's not what we should be doing.
Yeah, he makes this case for it being kind of scientific and empirical. Let's just read this paragraph. The notion that we cannot know what an author meant is also often based on confusion between knowledge and certainty. We can never be certain that a particular interpretation is correct or incorrect. Yet, as many authors emphasize, all empirical investigation is like interpretation in this respect. Whether the empirical data are texts, thumbprints, economic statistics, or readings of the movements of subatomic particles, we can never say with certainty that a particular explanatory hypothesis must be correct or incorrect. Okay, so he's making this case that, like, just like we're trying to figure out, whether atoms move under a certain way under certain conditions, we can look at that and interpret it. So we can also interpret, people's statements to understand the theory. It's equally a valid use of empirical data. I think that's a really interesting idea of interpretation. I found that like the most interesting thing nearly in the entire chapter.
Yeah, reading a text is a scientific investigation, and all the stuff written in the text is potential empirical evidence for an argument that is what your interpretation is. It's an explanatory hypothesis. Yeah, that is pretty cool. And I think part of what makes people resistant to that is what he says in the first sentence there, that people assume that knowledge of what an author meant is certainty about what an author meant. And he thinks that just a standard scientific standard here is not certainty. It's a plausibility of interpretation. And that sums up part of the next paragraph as well.
So I've just written something in my actual hard copy here, and I'm just trying to figure out where I made this point. Okay, this is a point here. Okay, so as 20th century philosophers of science have taught us, all theories can be made to fit the facts, but they cannot all do so plausibly, and thus their relative plausibility is the basis for discriminating amongst them. The same thing holds true in the case of interpretation. But this is an easy one, or an interesting one. I mean, like when I was reading this, I wrote down, this reminds me of like algorithmic information theory. A mathematician, Chaitan, who I've had on the podcast, done a lot of work in this about how you can interpret theories about how compressible they are. So the smaller the theory it is, and it can explain the most information, that should be thought of as the best theory. And he's trying to get to the point here is that, like, look, we can rank interpretations. That philosophers of science and mathematicians or whatever have come up with theories on how we should rank them. And if we see, like, the TSSI, for example, explains Marx and it's succinct and understandable and it does so better than the rest, you could rank it first. That's the way I kind of think about this stuff.
Yeah. He discusses two like academic cases that sort of demonstrate his point. One of which is just someone named Fish repeating that we are right to rule out at least some readings. I don't know if Fish is particularly relativist or something, so whatever. But then he goes on to a fun science troll example where a Derrida style deconstructionist argues that his interpretation, let's see, Plotnitsky's interpretation of an exchange on Einstein's physics or something like that.
That's not a paper I would like to read.
Yeah, right. He basically says that it can be ascertained with a reasonable degree of certainty that Hippolyte suggests a possibility of some connections between Derrida's ideas and relativity. So, like, that even crazy ass postmoderns who are fucking nuts and having a field day with the interpretations of the text, even they don't say that all textual interpretation is just as good. Like,
there you have it. There you have it. Let's get on. Let's move on. Okay. Here we get into the thing I think that Rosa was talking about earlier, is the criterion of coherence. So a principal founder of textual hermeneutics is this dude here called Friedrich Schleiermacher. Okay. And his point was to distinguish genuine understanding from misunderstanding. We genuinely understand a text, for example, only if the individual of the parts are reconciled and brought together as aspects of the whole. So this is kind of an important thing. It is possible to go through certain parts of Marx, say in volume 1, where he sets values equal to prices, and then say in chapter 3 or in volume 3, where he gets rid of that what would you call it,
assumption. Axiom?
Assumption. Yeah, when he's trying to unfold his analysis out towards the real world, and you could have a part in the first part where it may say something that will actually contradict something, say, later on in volume 3, and you could say, look, this is an example of, say, Marx being inconsistent. But you could only make that argument if you didn't try and understand the whole thing as a whole, and look at how Marx was changing his assumptions in different parts for his theoretical undertaking. So this idea is you want to try and make the whole body of work make sense, and not just pick certain sentences to back up a certain interpretation you have, and not allow other interpretations or other sentences to come in that would show that your interpretation will be wrong. It's quite it's this idea of a systemic understanding of the text. Anybody have anything to say? I probably butchered that.
No,
you're fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's it's sort of an establishment of even looking at the text scientifically. I think this is probably the source of some of the ideas in the previous section.
Yeah, okay. This question. This says it a lot more elegantly than I have. For instance, part of Kosick's distinction between a substantiated interpretation and textual distortions or modifications is that the former will leave no opaque, unexplained, or accidental passages in the text. And that's just kind of clarifying what I said. Let's keep going here. See if there's anything else here. I do love the word exegetical.
Oh yeah, it's like a biblical word, right?
Yeah, I actually found a song about exegetical interpretation to the, you know, that like, is it a Korean rap song? Oh my God, what one is it? The G5. You know that one? Getting down like a G5
No,
or
actually.
something. You know that song?
No, I don't. You have to put me on to some Korean hip hop.
Oh God, it's really bad. I think it's Korean anyway, maybe American Korean.
I'll bump it.
Exeget.
Like a
Cool.
G6 that really.
That one. Yeah, that one. Yeah, exegetical.
Oh my God, exegesis.
God.
interpretation, is it?
That was. I didn't want to
anybody found
remember
it?
that song. I did not want to remember.
I put
that
it in
song.
one of my. Did anybody find the exegetical version of it? Oh God,
I've never
Was it
heard that. That's pretty
G6.
exegesis.
There's one. This exegesis like a G6 party. If only we can play this stuff through. I'm going to put it on. I'm going to put it on here and take off my headphones so people can hear this. This is fantastic.
All right, we're having a break.
All right, now 1 second. It's on mute.
You're physically hurting me right now. I want you to know that.
You should see the video. It's a lot worse.
You could show us the video.
Oh, I can show you the video.
No. We should focus on the text. Please, God, focus on the text.
Heresies will be stopping. 2 more verses.
Here's like I'm dancing here.
Take it out of context. Out of context. All the interpreters.
Oh my God.
Out of context.
Oh my God.
That's it. Sorry, people. That was
Oh my God. On the internet, they say I got 5 shades whiter that day.
what I can't believe is that only has 1,000 views.
Yeah, no, that's
That deserves a lot more.
It deserves a lot less.
If you look at the first comment as well, on the video. It's a comment from me from about 5 years ago saying, "Can I use this song in the podcast?" That was the only comment on the entire video. Now there are 3. Oh no, that was the third. That was the third comment. I don't think anybody's looked at the video since then. Okay, so sorry about that.
Chat's loving this, by the way.
I really did like. I must say, I really did like that song. God,
It's
Korean. Does anybody remember that? You remember it, do you? Rosa, you remember that actual real track?
Yes, I remember.
Am I right
the
saying they're
real
Korean?
song.
I think not fondly.
They were Asians of some kind
Yeah.
or something like
They were
that.
very-
Yeah.
Okay.
I can't do it off of. I can't do the phrenology off of memory. I'm sorry. I just can't.
The phrenology.
I'm
Oh
going
my
to
God.
look this up, you weirdo. Okay.
Like a G6.
All right.
Yeah.
Far East Movement is an American hip hop electronic group. Okay. It's worth noting. And let's see. Okay. They've worked with Korean pop star Tiffany. Okay. Is
There you
Tiffany
go.
on that one? Anyway, I don't know. No, Tiffany is not on that one. I don't know what's
Okay.
going on, people.
Sorry. Let's get back to work here.
Moving on. That's
Yeah.
going to be all cut.
Yes.
Anyway, hope you enjoyed that, people in the chat.
We're going to be finished this before Derek comes on. I
know.
guarantee you. Because the
We'll
chapter
just-
is... We can crack on to chapter 5 if people want.
Yeah,
after
we
this,
can
but,
just have Derek like sound off about exegesis
Yeah.
for a little bit to make up for it. No, we can move on.
Well, we have a okay. So let's we have done that. I think there's nothing really to say. Okay, here's okay now. Okay, so let's dear. Let's go to next. Section 4.6, Stigler's principle of scientific exegesis.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's start this one. The great merit of Stigler's 1965 textual exegesis as a scientific problem is that it showed how to apply the criterion of coherence to the interpretation of analytical work. His principle of scientific exegesis says that such an interpretation should be rejected if it cannot deduce the author's main analytical conclusions from her definitions and premises. So what Andrew is trying to get at here is that that if the TSSI is able to come up with its conclusions using their setup of what they think Marx said, and the other ones aren't, that really, if we're going to be scientific about it, the TSSI should have preference over the SSSI or the NI or the dual interpretations. And, there should be, there's a scientific way of looking about how we should be able to rank these guys. The PSSI has profound implications for the interpretive controversy for the theory. It implies that interpretations on which Marx's theory become internally consistent must be rejected. The evidence that Marx was inconsistent is therefore unsound, and since the evidence is unsound, Marx should be judged not guilty. Okay. And it's interesting, he goes into like who this Stigler dude is. Apparently he was like some Chicago school economist who are kind of notoriously right-wing economists, who was having a debate with this guy called Haim Barkai over Ricardo's theory of the demand for corn. Interesting, they're going into a debate on classical economics at this time, particularly in the 60s when neoclassical would have been dominant in somewhere like Chicago, you would have thought. But
the 60s, really?
Well, I would think so.
When does the Chicago school start?
Well, good question, but I would be surprised at the
40s.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's what I thought. Who was in Chicago? Was your man was one, wasn't he?
Oh,
granddaddy of neoliberalism. What do you call him? Oh my God.
Hayek, Friedman? Who are we talking about?
No, the other one. Jesus. Capitalism and freedom, or what's his name?
Well,
come
let's
on.
ask God. This is Milton Friedman.
Milton Friedman, yeah. I think he was one of the dudes. But anyway, but it's interesting. And I think, Stigler came up with this idea to kind of, make, to show, he came up with this idea in a similar, it's ironic that he came up with it in a similar kind of debate over not Marx's theory, but Ricardo's theory. Okay. Right. My concern here is not to decide who was right, but to discuss the test of interpretive adequacy that Stigler proposed. He objected to Barkai's selective use of quotations in order to make his case. Why, Stigler asked, should we allow the hand-picked quotation to carry an interpretation when we reject the hand-picked fact as an empirical test of a hypothesis? In fact, the two problems are basically the same. That's an interesting way of looking at it. Is like somebody was, I was listening to a Paul Cockshott video, and he was talking about, his ideas of taking random samples of people to make decisions on, different things in society, and it's a way to get rid of the class bias of representative democracy.
Sortition.
Yeah. And so he was saying in it like that, look, you would never ask if you wanted to find out what would the public were thinking about a political problem, you would never go like to the House of Commons or to the Senate, US Senate or something, and ask, the politicians and say, oh, that's what the people are thinking, because it wouldn't be a representative sample.
Right.
You
Right.
would
Right, of
you would
course.
you would take a sample from all over the place. And similarly, you
Yeah.
apply that exact same criteria to interpretation of scientific texts or any type of text.
I quite like
Uh,
that. That draws out the democratic motivations for this kind of philosophy of science.
Yeah. So okay, let's see what Andrew says. Yet the really brilliant aspect of Stigler's paper is his apparently novel understanding of what constitutes empirical evidence. In the case of an analytical text, he recognizes that textual evidence is not limited to passages in which an author sets out her definitions and premises. Another part of the evidence consists of her theoretical conclusions. Stigler thus proposed that a textual interpretation be judged according to whether it can hold both types of evidence together as a unified whole. Okay, the same stuff. We're hitting the same ideas again and again and again. But what Andrew is doing in this chapter, I think, he's, slowly and surely making his case for exactly what are the criteria that should be done in a scientific work, and how we should figure out who's right or who should we think is a better interpretation or a reasonable interpretation than other people's. But I think, to me, this stuff is very obviously correct. I just think that it's kind of common scientific sense what he's saying in here.
I do wonder what the counter argument to these things were.
I don't think there is a strict counter argument, if you know what I mean. I don't think they make an argument saying, well, I think a lot of the time is the argument that we see throughout the book here is that people say, well, that would only be correct if you interpret it like nobody else does. That's the kind of defense that people have made. This kind of security in numbers, but not scientific evidence.
Yeah. Yeah. When I say philosophy of science is democratic, I don't mean like, relativist pluralist. You know what I mean? I mean, I don't know. There's a sort of like there's supposed to be a deliberative advantage to having a big group of people trying to figure stuff out. And the problem is, I guess, when they're academic economists instead of people.
That's right. The robots, Russian bots.
That's like how John Dewey describes it. Like, you saw like the scientific method as fundamentally connected to democracy because of its like group process nature. Sort of like constantly reviewing like scientific discoveries in a group effort and a continuous discourse. So
Indeed.
Okay, let's keep going. I think we are.
Let's see, we've maximal likelihood as an
okay, let's read it.
Interpretive method. I like that.
Yeah, like he's using, ideas from statistical analysis, ideas that you would use if you're trying to understand, data. Let's read this paragraph here. Do you want to read this one?
Yeah.
Lexi?
Yeah. Finally, Stigler's analogy to maximum likelihood is a reference to the inferential character of interpretation. The concluding words of his paper were, let us recognize the fact that the interpretation of a man's position, especially if the man has a complex and subtle mind, is a problem in inference, not to be solved by the choice of quotations. Maximum likelihood estimation is a statistical technique in which one works backwards, beginning with the results of the sample data, and uses them to infer the mathematical relationship between the variables that exists in the larger population. The relationship one selects is the one that is most likely to have produced the observed data. Yeah. I mean, I think that's just cool. It's a cool way to explain what good philosophy of science is. And again, the fact that we have to spell these things out is evidence of the decadence of bourgeois consciousness from developed capitalism, because this is so clearly in the spirit of just basic humanism. Anything good about the Enlightenment had this in it. All the bad stuff probably did too, but you know what I mean? Like, maybe not all the bad stuff, actually. Anyway, the point is, without intuitions like this, science just doesn't work. I don't know what the counter argument is. That doesn't mean there isn't a counter argument. I just have a really hard time intuitively dropping into it.
Well, I think in this case, Barkai gave a counter argument. Will we have a look? Chapter 4.7, Barkai and Olander on the PSE. Let's have a look here. Barkai responded to Stigler about a year later. It takes him a long time, these guys, to respond. That he continued to affirm his own interpretation of Ricardo's theory is not surprising. What may be surprising is that Barkai nevertheless endorsed the PSE. This is the idea of the what does the PSE stand for again? Oh my God. Here we go. Principle of scientific exegesis.
Yes.
Okay.
Principle of scientific exegesis.
Like a G6. Now, what may be surprising is that Barkai nevertheless endorsed the PSE. After quoting Stigler in the opening sentence of his reply, the test of an interpretation is its consistency with the main analytical conclusions of the system of thought under consideration. Barkai remarked that this is undoubtedly a useful criteria, and I propose to apply it here. Oh, weird. Okay, let's not get into this. This is going to be too...
See, his response was, nah, you're right. That's cool.
Yeah, and they went on to argue accordingly. Okay, so let's not get into the detail. Yeah. Okay, but Olander does take issue with Stigler 65, but his criticisms pertain solely to other aspects of Stigler's position on interpretation. Okay, this is kind of, this is getting into the weeds here. I don't think there's much to be learned from here, but we all think that Stigler's idea of Christ Almighty, what's PSC stand for again?
Principle of scientific exegesis.
Yeah, that principle of scientific exegesis is a decent one.
There is an interesting part where he is like, all right, let me help these fools out, because no one's like attacking the main thing here. In 4.8, starting from the bottom of page 66, the PSE may at first seem to be a trick. Interpretation of definitions and premises in light of the conclusions may at first appear to be analogous to the case in which statisticians adulterate the data in order to reach their favored results. Then he argues against that. It's not the case that data is altered when it's reinterpreted to make them cohere with the conclusions. Statisticians' data are generated independently of the procedures that produce the data. But when you're reading a book, this is like part of the data collecting process. Like, this is just, it's impossible to not interpret.
Okay. Can we say all that again? Can we just, because it'll be a bit unclear. Let's just sure. Rehash your idea there so that when we're editing it'll come out good.
Sure. Which one here?
Both. Just go from the top there from
4.8. Okay. So Kleiman articulates some potential, like a potential counter argument here, that the PSE may at first seem to be a trick. I'm reading from the bottom of page 66. That maybe this is kind of like when statisticians are juggling and fudging stats to make their argument. But Kleiman's overall point is that this isn't exactly like that, because interpretation is intrinsic to the data collecting process for this kind of argument, because it's a book and you have to interpret a book to read it. So if you're a statistician in this sort of analogical example, all that data like kind of already exists out there. And you have to decide on a criteria. Sure, he doesn't actually say that, but I am. But that's not the same as interpretation playing the central role in the data collecting process. And that's why he doesn't feel like this counterargument works. How's that? Clear? Hello?
Sorry, I had my mic muted. Yeah, no, that's really very good. So I don't know if we have anything else to discuss in this. Let's have a look. Okay. Okay, he's going to get into a chapter now on the response, critics' responses to these ideas.
Yeah, mostly rejects the principle of scientific exegesis.
Okay. So. Yeah, well, that's really weird. So let's start here. Critics' responses. A few critics have responded, and some of them have basically give out about the PSE. Let's read here what Moseley said. Andrew Kleiman suggests that the main criterion for choosing between different interpretations of Marx's concept of constant capital is which interpretation can better derive more of Marx's main conclusions, most importantly, the falling rate of profit. I disagree. I argue that the main criterion for choosing between different interpretations of the determination of constant capital in the case of a change in the value of the means of production is what Marx himself actually wrote about this subject. Every time Marx wrote specifically about this subject, he assumed that constant capital is valued in current replacement costs in the sense indicated above. In this situation, it does not make sense to accept Andrew's interpretation of the valuation of constant capital because his interpretation makes it easier to derive a falling rate of profit. It may be easier to derive the falling rate of profit, but this interpretation contradicts everything Marx ever wrote specifically on this subject. Maybe if the text were more ambiguous, Andrew's criterion might be more appropriate. But in this case, the texts are unusually clear and consistent throughout Marx's manuscripts. Okay, so I think in this case, he's not really making, he doesn't have a problem with the, principle of scientific exegesis.
Yeah, what Kleiman says about it doesn't sound like what he's saying.
Yeah, but we'll get to it now in a minute. But
he's saying basically that like Kleiman doesn't live up to the PSE, right? I think that's a short way of summarizing.
Let's just read the first paragraph here first before we say that, because I know Andrew is very precise with what he says, and I think he likes the fact that Moseley will actually respond to him. So let's not try and get it wrong, just in case. Few critics of Marx's value theory or the TSSI have thought it necessary to respond to TSSI theorists' plea that the criterion of coherence in the PSE be brought to bear upon the interpretive controversy in value theory. The only papers that have engaged this issue are Moseley and Mohan. So he does say that they rejected the principle of exegesis, which is, I think, a bit, well, let's get a bit further and we'll come to the conclusion if you do.
But like, let's look at the alternative that they provide. So you know what, like, maybe I failed to appreciate the difference between PSE, let's say, and Moseley's criterion of is what Marx himself actually wrote about this subject.
So, I think what he's saying here is that Andrew is saying, that Andrew is not taking the totality of what Marx has wrote and making sense of it. Okay. So to me, that means that, he's not throwing out the PSE. He's saying that, if we actually use the PSE,
right,
you can't accept what you're saying, Andrew. Okay. So let's get into, so what we have to get to here is basically, is Moseley, is he right when he says Marx is saying things against what Andrew said? Because Moseley is here making a case that I think is scientifically valid. If he says Marx says this stuff, you know,
Yeah.
he's right that Andrew can't, go against all of these things. But if if it's a matter of interpretation about what Marx said and not a hard fact,
Yeah, every way I can conceive of this is some variant of the PSE.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let's have a look here. Part of okay, let's have a look here. Part of the reason why Moseley rejects such. Okay, let's read this entire paragraph because I think this is fairly juicy. Okay. Okay. Let me see if I can highlight it here for some reason. These PDFs don't like highlighting. Okay. They really are difficult to highlight. Okay. It is interesting that Moseley rejects this idea of testing his interpretation of Marx by seeing if it can be used to deduce a falling rate of profit. As we have seen, neither Stigler nor Barkai had any qualms about testing their interpretation of Ricardo in precisely this manner. Part of the reason why Moseley rejects such a test is that he falsely counterposes what Marx himself actually wrote to the derivation of a falling rate of profit, as if the issue were the ease with which different interpretations can make the rate of profit fall. In fact, what is at issue is the ability of different interpretations to make two aspects of the text, premises and conclusions, cohere. The question is, which interpretation of the premises that Marx himself actually wrote down coheres with the conclusion of the fall of the tendential fall with the conclusion of the law of the tendential fall of the rate of profit that Marx himself actually wrote down as well. Okay, so what Andrew is saying here is that Moseley's interpretations of what Marx wrote don't lead to the conclusions. And what Andrew is saying is that my interpretations of what Marx wrote lead to the conclusions. Okay. Yeah. So Derek has just sent me it just hit me up. Let me just send him the link in the chat. Okay. 1 second, everybody. Sorry for the interruption.
No problem.
Do you want to talk there for a while?
Yeah. So I hear some crunching. It sounds delicious.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to eat a gyro on my bed.
So
I know that.
Eat it with it muted. So yeah, Kleiman kind of correctly identifies that there's a false counterposition between what Marx wrote and the derivation of falling rate of profit, considering there's some texts about the falling rate of profit. And it just seems like they are having an interpretive dispute with a broad corpus of texts. And like, perhaps there are different parts of it that disagree with each other, and they're prioritizing different texts in trying to make a logical coherence. I don't think Andrew says this, but that's how I'm interpreting what's going on. What's up, Derek?
Yeah, I think hi, Derek.
Hello.
Let me just finish a point here, and then we'll bring you in, Derek. We're nearly finished this chapter, so we've been like flashing through it. We haven't had any problems yet. There's no math in it, so we're all right. I think what he's saying is that that Moseley and Andrew both are interpreting his premises. Okay, and Andrew's interpretation of these premises lead to the conclusions, and Moseley's don't. So you're not, the premises themselves have to be interpreted as well. You have to interpret, the axioms or whatever, if you want to put it in like a kind of a analytical term, mathematical way. You have to get your axioms correct. And Andrew and him are disagreeing over what the axioms are. And Andrew's making the point that, well, look, my axioms give the conclusions. So surely mine are better than yours. And Moseley is saying, no, you can't choose them axioms because they're not accurate. And I think that's where this disagreement is coming up. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, that sounds fair. I think they each have a textual claim because, yeah, and I think that's part of the reason that there's been, you know, I don't know, that would be a reason, right, to attack Marx's commitment to the falling rate of profit, as is done with like Marxist philology, right? Like Michael Heinrich is big on this, basically, that thinking that basically Marx kind of fell out of love with that thesis. It wasn't never really his anyway. That, you know, he might have put that aside by the end of his life. Which, I mean, you know, it's a possibility. I don't know. I don't know the mega, you know. It is something that predates Marx. It's a thesis from classical political economy. It might be true for, you know, reasons independently of what Marx identified. I mean, that could be true.
You think he would have actually wrote it down somewhere, though, if it was true?
Yeah.
You know, I've never heard of anybody with a letter from Marx saying, "Oh yeah, that falling rate of profit stuff is bullshit." But
yeah, well, I was such an idiot.
But the whole complication that he never published this. Like,
no, but even in his letters,
it's true.
You know,
no. I mean, I actually do think. I mean, I think Marx believed in a falling rate of profit, and B, I think it's true. But I just want to like put the best argument, the best counter argument out there, is that this was like volumes 2 and 3 were not published; they weren't ready. There are variants of them, I believe. Haymarket just released what they're calling the economic manuscripts that. Which made up volumes 2 and 3 before Ingalls edited them together. So I mean,
oh snap, that's exciting.
Yeah, I forgot who did it, but it's in the historical materialism series. So you know, we can check this stuff a little bit better now. But at the same point, like, we're making an argument about something that is, I think you're right, Lexi. It's part of it. It's in Smith. It's one of the many things about Smith that no one points out. While I was running errands today, I made the mistake of having a fight with a libertarian, so I got Smith on my mind.
And Ricardo, by the way, Grossman is good on this.
Yeah, and Ricardo holds to it too. I'm pretty sure pretty much everybody before the late 18th century Austrians held on to this. I mean, even some of them did. Like Schopenhauer kind of believes in the falling rates of profits. He just thinks it's for a different reason. He blames democracy. But,
he would.
Okay. Can I just write? Can I read this? Just this paragraph here before we get off. And we'll come back to you, Derek, and we'll come back to you about the whole chapter in one go. Do you want to do that?
Sure, we can do that.
Because we're just nearly there. Yeah, we're just on the last little
4 paragraphs, right?
Yeah. Okay, let me read this one here. I just want to say, only Derek could go out to do some errands and end up like in a fist fight with a libertarian. Fair play, Derek.
Help! Help! He's violating the NAP. Help!
Help, the bastard. Okay. Now, let me get a drink of water before I say this. Okay. Notice that. Okay, let's read sugar. One second. Okay. Yet the more fundamental reason why Moseley rejects the PSE is that he simply refuses, without explaining why, to accept that interpretations should be judged by their ability to make sense, to make text cohere as a whole. Notice that rather than taking the whole of Marx's text into account, he excludes everything from consideration except what Marx wrote specifically about this subject. Moreover, he defines this subject in a very narrow way. Not only is the long-term falling rate of profit not part of this subject, neither is Marx's overall theory of how constant capital value is determined. For Moseley, this subject is only what Marx wrote specifically about the determination of constant capital value in the particular case in which the value of the means of production changes. This definition of the subject enables him to dismiss as irrelevant a great many of passages in which Marx states that the constant capital component of commodities values is determined temporally. Moseley contends that these passages are irrelevant because they do not explicitly address the case in which values change. Okay, so that's where this big disagreement. I think that paragraph is quite clear, as in that, you have to take everything into account about, say, constant capital and what he wrote about it, and not just one bit. That if your interpretation doesn't cohere with the rest of all those other ones, it probably is not as good as interpretation as one that does. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a thing. Can anyone really disagree with the PSE?
No. Like, I think you could disagree with, like, I think it's reasonable that Mosley could think that Andrew's way of interpreting is wrong.
Right.
I don't get the idea that, obviously, I think in this idea, it's one of those cases where they're both making the strong argument about when is reasonable, where should you interpret it, and what is your criteria for interpreting this specific point? And, this is, I don't think this is a bad faith argument. I think this is a good faith argument. But I think that Andrew, we will get to the actual evidence later on, I think in chapter 5, or chapter 6. But I think that the evidence is on Andrew's side. That's the way I put it. I think he's a bit harsh in saying that Mosley is not is rejecting the PSE. I think that's maybe a bit harsh, but I think that when I look at, say, Kleiman's interpretation versus what we're getting from Mosley, I think Andrews makes more sense. That's the way I would put it.
Yeah, I was about to say that I thought this Mosley was a little bit overly polemical, not that specific, but this is a great point. Like, if your specific reading of one text causes that text to fall into conflict with everything else, then heuristic of celerity would indicate that your novel reading is over favoring an idiosyncratic thing with an interpretation that messes everything else up. You shouldn't do it. I mean, that's pretty simple.
Yeah, and it's implicit in this argument, and I think Kleiman is fond of like downplaying this. That the falling rate of profit is a very important, the tendential fall of the rate of profit is a very important theory in Marxian economics. It's the crisis mechanism, even though there are other tendencies that are part of that. And for all the reasons that, post-Keynesians are interested in, whatever, but the central claim of Marxist economics, the long-term claim that, I think Marxists have correctly identified, it fucking dooms capitalism from endogenous tendencies. That's an important part of the theory.
Well, I mean, otherwise it makes it purely a political project.
Right. Like, if you just don't be like, look, this is this is a very important part of Marx's work, and that's why we're going to prioritize it over these, some pissings that he wrote in some mail to his, wife's cousin, in the 1860s. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I don't want to get us too far off, and maybe we can talk about this in the whole chapter, but I've just been reading this chapter. I've been thinking about all the other ways in which almost all the Marxists that currently exist pick something about Marxism they want to ignore. So This doesn't surprise me as a tendency at all.
I mean, it's kind of hard when a lot of Marx is just unpublished too, major texts that people consider major texts, like German Ideology, Critique of Philosophy of Right. Those are not really public works that were published during Marx's time, and they're manuscripts essentially.
Same is true with Goethe Critique. I mean, pretty much actually all the major stuff outside of the Manifesto and Capital Volume 1 wasn't published during Marx's lifetime, and a lot of it wasn't published until the 50s. So,
Okay, can we read this next chapter, because I think it's our next chapter, next paragraph. I think it's good. Okay. Why does this make such passages irrelevant? Moseley is arguing, in effect, that a general statement never applies to a particular case unless it explicitly includes that particular case. This is simply not so. General statements automatically apply to all particular cases that they do not explicitly exclude. For instance, if I say vitamins are good for you without explicitly listing all of the particular cases to which I intended to apply, and the months ending in or, in the years in which Brazil wins the World Cup, and when it is sunny, and if you stop liking reggae. I like that example, liking reggae. It is my statement inapplicable in these cases. Similarly, Marx wrote at the start of Capital that abstract labor is the substance of value without explicitly stipulating that this statement applies to the case in which commodities values change. Does this make the statement irrelevant to that case? Clearly not. Moseley, however, contends that implicitly all of these passages in which Marx discusses the determination of constant capital value in temporal terms are under the assumption that the value of the means of production does not change. But he provides no evidence to substantiate this assertion, and no evidence seems to exist. Thus, he apparently regards it as a logical deduction, since the passages do not explicitly state that they apply to the case in which values are changing. They implicitly assume that values are not changing. This is like saying that since my statement, vitamins are good for you, does not explicitly stipulate that it applies to months ending in or, its scope is implicitly restricted to the remaining months. You know, I think it's hard to argue with these arguments. You know, all the way through this chapter, I just feel like I'm just going tick, yeah, tick, tick. So I can understand why Andrew thinks that he rejects it when we get into it a bit more, but I do think some of the time, some of this is that people are defending their position. I think there's an awful lot of that going on. But okay, so I don't know. I think we've done this chapter. Do we want to say what Mohan said? Mohan has something in here. Do we want to say that?
Yeah, let's drop into some Mohan.
Okay.
Well, he's far more encouraging. That's good.
That's true. He's the first critic of the TSSI to not acknowledge that in order to properly evaluate the adequacy of different interpretations, a clear criteria of decidability is needed. Although he does not explicitly endorse the PSE, which he calls the criteria of replication. Interesting. Mohan employs it in order to test the relative adequacy of the TSSI and the new interpretation. He concludes that the TSSI and NI perform equally poorly. While I believe that this conclusion is incorrect, Okay. I don't think we need to go into that. Anyway, but right, Derek, let's give you the floor here. What were your ideas or what was your feeling about chapter 4?
Aside from a few times where it dips in the polemics that kind of ascribe motives, I think it's pretty clear that most of the interpretations have some kind of heuristic bias that causes problems elsewhere that are being ignored. And so if you do think that Marxism, or not Marxism, that Marx is making a kind of coherent argument, then this interpretation allows for everything to pretty much stay where they are, whereas a lot of these other coherencies create problems in other documents, or create problems for other interpretations, or create blind spots in ways that you can't justify unless you think Marx was kind of dumb. Like, I don't really know how else to phrase it. I mean, that's a very general statement. I do like when he talks about Mohan here, because it does show that there are disagreements that he thinks are more. He might disagree with them, but he thinks that they're framed in a way that are more fair, and I'm glad he brings that up. Any other major themes? I mean, it is interesting to contrast this with all the work on the philology. That's the only thing that comes to my mind. And I know that a lot of Kleinman's fights after this, but not before, but after this book was published, was based on that. Was disagreements about how you interpreted the philological record, and I do admit that there are big problems with that. I mean, because there's just so much that Marx didn't publish. We don't know why he didn't publish it. Some things we do know why, but like that there's a larger project that this stuff was a part of that wasn't finished. I mean, if you read Hal Draper, that becomes interesting, but those aren't like, I still don't think those really change TSSI, because TSSI makes what we have make sense. And a lot of the other interpretations don't give you a way to make other stuff make sense. And I think it's pretty simple. I mean, like this chapter is fairly convincing to me. It's to me probably more convincing than the prior chapter, even though the prior chapter does have that math thing that the dirty Shafians did. But whatever. What did you guys think?
Well, I think we're all in kind of agreement that that chapter is pretty solid, and that we're kind of interested to get onto some of the more juicy stuff.
Signing off on that, yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Let's see. Chapter 5, beginning of chapter 5 is really stuff we've already covered, right? Simultaneism, physicalism.
Yeah, there is some. I think this is the key chapter in it, though. We start getting into some tables and some math and stuff. I don't know if we want to have a shorter one tonight, or do we want to actually hit into that? I haven't read that chapter yet.
I haven't either.
Okay, well then.
I mean, I've read it before, but not in a long time. So I'm.
Let's.
Yeah, I've done. What I have done is I've done out the mathematics that are in there. I've actually written them out on pen and paper and taken photos so that we can share them as well. So I don't know if anybody else found them math tricky or couldn't follow them, but so
I think I can follow them, but again, like my math is like, college statistics, and that's where it stops. So,
and everybody knows statistics is not math anyway, So I'm joking. Okay, so let's have a look at the chat and see what's going on. There's a lot of talk in the chat about Marx having a sore ass, which I must admit I started.
But didn't he historically actually have a sore ass? I mean, like,
yeah. The bourgeoisie will remember my carbuncles until their dying day.
If anybody wants to see what he actually had, I have it open here. It's called, I think, who was it? Erica, I think in the chat said he was.
No, thank you, Tom. No, thank you, Tom. I
want to see the scroll.
I would prefer not to. All right, I'm averting my eyes, people.
That looks nasty. Oh my god!
I'm not
so there we go.
We're subjected to a horrible parody song. We might as well just list off all the horrible bumps and bruises and weird blisters and like fungal infections that Marx had.
Derek,
I have had a whole lot of people talk to me about why Marx's polemics got so mean towards the end of his life. He was just constant pain. I mean, I've actually
that does make sense.
Times. So
he was a pretty cruel interlocutor,
and it got worse over time. I mean, some of the stuff he says about in letters, like about LaSalle and stuff, we've talked about before, and there's really no excusing some of it.
He calls him the N-word, a Jewish N-word. I mean, that is grotesque.
Yeah, and
all the time.
So what do you call him? A Jewish N-word?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ferdinand Lassalle, the hero of German labor. He calls it. What is wrong with you, Karl Marx? Well, carbuncles.
Because if someone
it's actually worse than that. He speculates on whether he's black. He speculates on it,
for knowledge,
whether he's, and then he goes into a thing explaining on how they're inferior, and like how Darwin's theory of evolution can't fully explain why the blacks are inferior. It's like a weird diet and climate thing.
Weird.
Yeah,
This
it's
is
a
yeah.
entire climate thing.
Carl comes up in the middle of that. Could you just like maybe it's a good thing that Ingalls actually was the one who wrote on biology and not Marx? I mean, like,
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, Engels was like, yeah, Carl. I mean, I don't know. If capital is as powerful as we say it is, maybe it's like reconfiguring people, and a lot of these social traits are, reified forms of labor division. I don't know. I'm just drunk on my yacht. I don't know, Carl. I'm just trying to be chill. You could be racist if you want. I'm just gonna go over here and smoke some blunts. Fucking Freddie Engels, take it easy.
I mean, was Engels less racist though?
no. Well,
Oh.
he was more. He was. That's hard to actually say. He does have this whole weird stuff about historical peoples versus not historical
yeah,
peoples.
it's just, yeah. That stuff is
He also
is
thought
weird.
that Aboriginals were cannibals.
Yeah, but everybody thought that.
That
I
was
mean, like
commonplace
that's a
anthropological.
little bit more.
Yeah, it was bad anthropology.
Like people were actually publishing that crap.
It was bad
in journals.
anthropology.
But I mean, because he also like some of his Ingalls' crazy stuff about like older feminine cults are also like bad romantic anthropology. But
I'm not saying he's not racist, but he's not doing social Darwinism to explain why the blacks are inferior. Like he when I'm reading the Origin of the Family, he doesn't
Well,
seem.
I mean, Marx is technically not. He's doing another really dumb racial theory sort of thing that tries to explain it through climate.
Actually, he sounds like Oswald Spengler when in that weird letter. I mean, we're really off topic, but I mean, like, but I just want to say one of my friends pointed out, like, at least he had the good sense never at a time where it would have been really easy to talk about that in public. Marx didn't. Like, like we do have at least that.
He privately held social Darwinist racial views, but did not talk about them openly. I suppose there is that.
I mean,
they are of their time as well. Like, that they thought that what's the phrenology? They both thought phrenology was a science.
Yeah, and they also thought Lemurians were real too. I mean, like,
also Hegel is full of dodgy stuff.
Hegel
says stuff like moving to the New World will make Europeans smaller.
But he also said,
what a dick.
Chomsky has a quote of his, about how, like, the people of the American Native Americans are, vanishing from history due to, I don't know, history getting better, or I can't remember. It's just like one of these quotes where he just like says, he just makes all the genocide of the Native Americans grand. Yeah, because it's history playing out in progress.
Yeah, that's the
but I mean, that's the same logic that we have in Napoleon, though. I mean, and Marx flirted with that about, because their writings on colonialism in India, they originally weren't opposed. They thought it was like bringing progressive bourgeois civilization. They only changed on that later.
Yeah, after seeing what it did.
Which admittedly, I mean, once I saw what it did and like the East India Company's famines and stuff, I can't believe this came up in a discussion today. Like, they realized, oh, this is probably bad.
Yeah, actually, this is fucked.
Yeah.
So I mean, like, I'm not gonna I don't want to tar Marx and Engels as being totally regressive for their time period, because that's something that a lot of people do. I mean, I love libertarians bringing this up selectively, not for even though they Herbert Spencer was awesome, but Marx was racist. I was like, what?
Anarchists also do this, which is even more hilarious because one could argue that it's worse with Proudhon and Bakunin.
Bakunin? Oh man, dude is a pogromist.
Bakunin was the person who invented the idea of the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy, and there are right wingers who love him, and like other anarchists just ignore that, just completely ignore it.
Yeah, you could argue that like structural anti-Semitism is a problem within like anarchism as a whole due to that sort of like not having like a sort of analysis of capital that balances out agency with like just the inherent structure of capital.
Is that why a lot of anti-Semites like Maoism for some reason that I never understood?
Okay, we're way off track here. I'm
Yeah.
reading this in.
Are we? We're not. You didn't read the part about anti-Semitic Maoism in this book.
Oh,
Carbuncle!
chapter
It's-
4.9.B.7.
Yeah, it's
Footnote 11.
I believe it's 4.10.
Okay, well, I think we should wrap up for today. Let's have a short one instead of going on for 9 hours. Rosa wants to go.
I get accidentally knocked out of these things
Yeah.
just
All right.
because Hangouts is stupid. But yeah, what were you about to say, Derek?
Shut up, Rosa. Shut up. We're just about to say that we're not talking about this anymore. We're going to go offline.
Because this is a good place to end this, and we're going to get real off topic. I was just talking about carbuncles being painful.
And then we got the phrenology somehow.
Okay, let's give a shout out to everybody in the chat. Let's see if we can give them all before we go.
Yeah.
We have myself, Erica, Alex, Marshall Villager, a new one. How's it going? Dr. Forbin, long-time listener. How's it going? Who else do we have? We've got Data Lore made an appearance. Hello, Data Lore. Oh man, Damp checks in. How's it going, Damp man? And is that it? We also have Hibaru-san. Hibaru-san making
Erica, pay your library fees so we can get that book.
Benjamin Hanshu liked the G6 song as I did. I got up and danced. Who else do we have?
Dr. Forbin?
Dr. Forbin, no, Dr. Yeah, well, that's it. I think to play us out, then we should have a little bit more of exegesis like G6 because that is one of the best videos of all time. I'm going to put it on nice and loud, and I'm going to let the video on here so everybody can see it.
Don't forget Marshall. Don't forget Marshall Villager.
Oh, Marshall Villager, yeah. Okay. Let me see if I can share this.
And Dylan, thanks for popping
Derek,
in, Dylan.
Derek, this is for you.
And Benjamin Handshoe.
Oh,
Benjamin.
you know, if you can edit it somewhat, you should do like a bass boosted version of it. Of the song.
A what version?
A bass boosted version of the song.
Oh yeah.
No.
I just like the dancing.
Derek, can I get your immediate commentary on this?
This is special. Is this from like a Christian college or something?
They have to be Christians.
Two more versions, take it straight to the top. Allegories, don't do it.
Goodbye, everybody. I can't put you through any more of this.
Have a good
Bye.
Have a good weekend, people.